Welcome. Our focus today is on building a high-speed clinical roadmap for managing osteomyelitis.
A real cure hinges on two perfectly synchronized components: aggressive surgical debridement of all infected bone and prolonged targeted antibiotic therapy. If those two pillars aren't solid, recurrence is almost a certainty.
Exactly. So let's start with the microbiology. How does this infection even begin? So question one, what is the single most common organism we're dealing with here in both adults and kids?
That is almost always Staphylococcus aureus. It just dominates in both acute and chronic hematogenous cases. You really have to start your thinking with S. aureus until you're proven otherwise.
And of course, when we say S. aureus, the next thought has to be about resistance.
Yeah.
That completely changes the game from minute one.
It does, exactly. Oh, we can't ignore methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus or MRSA. I mean, in a lot of hospitals, MRSA accounts for over a third of all staph isolates. This prevalence means your initial empiric coverage must account for MRSA. That's before you even get culture data back. It's a non-negotiable decision point.
Okay, so beyond S. aureus, what other bugs should be on our immediate differential?
Your common suspects are going to be coagulus-negative staph, beta-hemolytic streptococcus, and then various gram-negative bacilli. So think things like Pseudomonas species and E. coli. What we really have to recognize are the niche pathogens, the ones that flag a very specific underlying condition in your patient.
Give us the key associations, the ones that should be a major red flag for everyone listening.
Okay, two critical ones. First, if you have a patient with sickle cell disease, you must immediately worry about salmonella.
Right, salmon.
For hematogenous osteomyelitis, yes. And second, if you see spinal involvement, especially in a patient with pulmonary symptoms or an exposure history, you have to be vigilant for Mycobacterium tuberculosis. These connections are critical because your standard empiric therapy is going to fail those patients completely.
Okay, let's talk about the initial insult. What are the three ways infection actually gets to the bone?
So three main mechanisms. First is hematogenous spread. This is the main route in kids, and it also accounts for most adult vertebral infections. Second is contiguous spread. This is from nearby soft tissue infections, think trauma, post-surgery, or large pressure ulcers. And the third is direct inoculation, so open fractures or the placement of orthopedic hardware.
And what clinical signs should trigger an immediate high-priority investigation?
Look for the classic triad of high suspicion. A patient presenting with, say, fever and bacteremia or endocarditis, who then suddenly develops new unexplained spinal pain. Or, clinically, the ability to pass a probe directly into an ulcer and physically touch bone.
The probe-to-bone test.
Yes, that specific physical finding is highly suggestive. It demands immediate action.
All right, let's pivot to diagnostics. This is all about speed versus certainty.
Yeah.
So what's the initial imaging study and why is it?
Plain radiographs, they're always the first thing ordered, but they are so time-dependent, they require about 14 days after onset to show any changes.
2 weeks.
2 weeks. And that's because they miss the infection until 50 to 75% of the bone matrix has been destroyed. So for an acute presentation, they really only provide a baseline and rule out other, gross pathology.
So if x-rays have this 2-week delay, how do we confidently rule the diagnosis out early and move on? What's the gold standard for early detection?
That's going to be magnetic resonance imaging, the MRI. An MRI can detect the infection within just 3 to 5 days of onset. It gives you excellent delineation of soft tissue and bone marrow involvement, and it performs very well. Sensitivity is usually in the range of 78 to 90%, and specificity is about 60 to 90%.
And here's the key takeaway for the clinician, right? A powerful diagnostic shortcut.
Yes, and it's this. If you get a high-quality negative MRI 1 week after the symptoms start, you can effectively exclude osteomyelitis. It can save the patient from a long, unnecessary course of antibiotics. That is just invaluable in managing risk.
Now, moving beyond imaging, why is getting a bone biopsy so important, even if you already have positive blood cultures?
The bone biopsy is absolutely critical. It serves two purposes. One, it provides the histopathological diagnosis, which confirms the infection. And two, it definitively identifies the causative organisms from the bone itself. Superficial wound cultures or swabs from a draining sinus tract, they correlate poorly with the true pathogen, often less than 50%.
So you treat the bone, not the skin.
Exactly. You have to know what's growing in the bone.
Okay, and what about timing? What's the ideal timing for that biopsy relative to starting therapy?
Ideally, the percutaneous biopsy is done before any antibiotic is started. That's the perfect world scenario. If antibiotics have already begun, stopping them for 48 to 72 hours before the biopsy may increase the yield. But We have to be practical. If the patient is septic or if the delay is clinically prohibitive, you just proceed with the biopsy without stopping antibiotics. The cultures often stay positive, but we're trying to maximize our diagnostic yield whenever we can.
Let's shift gears to the operational side of management. So, why is surgical debridement considered mandatory even when we have our most potent antibiotics on board?
It really comes down to penetration. Antibiotics simply cannot achieve therapeutic concentrations inside necrotic bone or foreign bodies or dense fluid collections. That dead tissue acts like a fortress for the bacteria. The surgery's entire purpose is the complete removal of all that necrotic, non-viable bone to expose what's left to systemic antibiotics.
What about when there's prosthetic hardware involved? What are the primary decision points there?
So generally, the hardware has to come out to get a cure. There is, however, a very narrow exception. If the joint is stable, say a well-fixed hip replacement, and the infection is caused by a very susceptible low-virulence organism, like a Streptococcus species, we can attempt an extended suppressive antibiotic course for several months without removal. But that's the exception, not the rule.
But in most cases, especially with the more aggressive bacteria, removal is necessary. Which surgical approach gives us the lowest risk of recurrence?
The two-stage exchange arthroplasty is overwhelmingly preferred. It's much better than a one-stage procedure. When you're dealing with virulent bacteria like Staphylococcus aureus, the two-stage approach lets you remove the infected hardware, put in an antibiotic-loaded cement spacer, and then have a long systemic antibiotic washout period.
Right, clearance phase.
Exactly. That clearance phase, before the new prosthesis goes in, dramatically lowers the risk of recurrent infection compared to trying to do it all in one sitting.
Okay, let's focus specifically on native vertebral osteomyelitis NVO. When is surgery actually necessary for this presentation? Because medical management often works here.
You're right, NVO rarely requires surgery. Intervention is really limited to specific emergent circumstances, so neurological complications where you need to relieve spinal cord compression, or just outright failure of aggressive medical treatment. And finally, the need to surgically drain large epidural or paravertebral abscesses that aren't responding to guided aspiration.
And it's not just about the infection, it's about the patient, the host. What critical host factors have to be aggressively managed before you even think about surgery or long-term antibiotics?
This is fundamental to success. It really is. First, you have to aggressively control diabetes mellitus. Hyperglycemia just impairs the immune response and vascular perfusion,
Which you need for antibiotic delivery.
which you absolutely need. Second, address malnutrition, which severely impedes wound healing. Third, manage or stop tobacco use immediately. The vasoconstriction is a killer. And finally, if there's significant peripheral vascular disease, revascularization of the limb has to be done before any definitive surgical debridement. You have to ensure future antibiotic delivery and healing. If you ignore these factors, you're setting surgery up for failure.
All right, let's get into the specifics of the antibiotics. This is the long game. So before we have culture results, what's the recommended empiric regimen to cover the necessary spectrum?
You need something broad spectrum. It has to cover gram-positives, including MRSA, and the common gram-negatives. That's the baseline.
Can you give us a very specific high-yield example regimen and dosing for the listener?
Sure. You'd start with vancomycin, typically dosed at 15 milligrams per kilogram intravenously every 12 hours. And you have to remember, this will require therapeutic drug monitoring for troughs. You then pair that with a potent gram-negative agent. This is often a third-generation cephalosporin, like ceftriaxone, 2 grams intravenously daily, or a beta-lactam-beta-lactamase inhibitor, like piperacillin-tazobactam, dosed at 3.375 grams intravenously every 8 hours.
That covers the breadth. Now, let's narrow it down. We have culture data back.
Right.
What are the protocols for the most common and maybe the most challenging pathogens?
Okay, so for confirmed MRSA, the treatment of choice is vancomycin intravenously. A key alternative is linezolid, dosed at 600 milligrams intravenously every 12 hours. And the big advantage of linezolid is its excellent oral bioavailability, which makes step-down therapy much easier.
What about for good old penicillin-sensitive S. aureus?
The preferred agent there is actually penicillin G, dosed high at 4 million units intravenously every 6 hours. A very common alternative, though, is cefazolin, 2 grams intravenously every 8 hours.
And what if we isolate the challenging gram-negative Pseudomonas aeruginosa?
The treatment of choice there is usually an anti-pseudomonal beta-lactam. So cefepime, 2 grams intravenously every 12 hours, or ceftazidime, 2 grams intravenously every 8 hours. Meropenem, 1 gram IV every 8 hours, is a really strong alternative, especially if you're worried about resistance.
And lastly, for a quinolone-sensitive enterobacteriaceae.
Ciprofloxacin is the agent of choice. You can dose this at 400 milligrams intravenously twice a day, but it can be switched to 750 milligrams orally twice a day. And that offers, significant flexibility for outpatient management.
Now, for maybe the most important question, what is the absolute standard duration of total antibiotic therapy for osteomyelitis?
The standard duration is 4 to 6 weeks of parenteral, or at least highly bioavailable oral antibiotic therapy. That duration is mandatory. It's to ensure eradication within those remaining bone margins and to prevent short-term recurrence, which of course brings up a critical timing question.
Right. Can we ever safely shorten that course? And if so, under what very specific conditions?
Yes, you can, but only if the infected bone is completely removed. So that means the entire segment is resected, or the limb is amputated, and you have clean, disease-free margins confirmed by pathology.
Pathologically confirmed.
Has to be. In that one specific scenario, a shorter 2-week course of post-operative antibiotics is enough to clear any residual tissue infection. But that is the only scenario that justifies shortening the duration. This whole process, it just requires exceptional coordination. The need for that multidisciplinary team infectious disease, orthopedic surgeons, specialized wound care, clinical pharmacists, it really cannot be overstated. Their seamless collaboration is the only way to ensure the patient stays compliant and gets proper drug monitoring over those 4 to 6 weeks.
So to synthesize this for everyone listening, dual treatment with aggressive surgery and extended antibiotics is mandatory for a cure. MRI is your preferred tool for an early definitive diagnosis. And that specific antibiotic protocol, the precise dosing, and the commitment to the 4 to 6 week duration, they have to be strictly followed.
Right. We've covered the necessity of the acute cure, but we have to end by acknowledging the long-term shadow this disease casts. While acute cases, they have a favorable prognosis with this kind of aggressive treatment, recurrence is a substantial risk. For chronic osteomyelitis, the recurrence rate is approximately 30% at 12 months. But what's really alarming, and something for you to remember, is that this rate skyrockets to 50% when the initial pathogen is Pseudomonas aeruginosa. And this just underlines the fact that achieving a true permanent eradication is an ongoing clinical struggle, even after those first 6 weeks of intense therapy are over.